I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico. Welcome to New Mexico History in 10 minutes. Yeah, you heard right. I'm going to talk about history and see where we go with this. I think it would be a fun thing to do to learn about history in general and New Mexico history specifically. Before we talk about history, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about prehistory. Prehistory is before history started. Well, prehistory begins about 50,000 years ago when our ancestors originated in Africa and started to move to populate the planet Earth. We need to understand that all of our ancestors, doesn't matter if you're European, Native American, African, Middle Eastern, Asian, whatever, all of our ancestors started out as hunters and gatherers. That means that they were nomadic. Nomadic means they moved around. They were at the mercy of nature and had to follow their food source. That means they moved around in small groups that could be sustained by plants, berries, nuts, and various animals that they had to follow to kill and eat. They also had to avoid being killed and being eaten by animals and other human beings. So it was a very, very difficult kind of life, but that's how we all started. That's prehistory. We were nomadic. Later, we become sedentary. That's when we settle down and stay in one place. But for thousands of years, we were nomadic, following the food source out of Africa, going into the Middle East, and then from there, shooting off at various groups. They shoot off into other directions, various directions, such as going to Europe, Asia, India, Indonesia, that part of the world. Later on, roughly about 15,000 years ago, they crossed the Bering Strait into the Americas, and that's where the Native American people come from. So the point I want to make is that we're all the same, okay? We all came from the same place. So this is prehistory. Now, what starts to change, probably around 11,000 years ago, is our ancestors. They were very ingenious people. They were looking for ways to sustain themselves because as they moved around, each area had a carrying capacity, okay? This is how many people an area can sustain before it becomes overextended, and then people have to move on to other areas. What people start to notice is they start looking at food and where food grows. This is very important because now we're moving out of prehistory and into history. Okay? So what people start to do is they start to notice that along riverbanks, food is growing. And they start to manipulate that situation. They start using the water to grow grains. The first grains that they start to manipulate and grow are wheat and barley. And they start picking the kernels that are bigger to grow bigger kernels. And this is quite amazing. I don't think I could do that. I think these people were pretty smart. So they start controlling their food source. They start controlling the flow of water. And this is where we start to become sedentary. We start to become people who settle in one place and control our food source. We domesticate plants, okay? So this starts first in the Middle East, where we have the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. This is where civilization begins. Sumer, the Sumerians, they're the first to do this, okay? So now we're going to talk about history, okay? This is where history begins. We start to manipulate and control our food sources. We domesticate plants, and then we start to domesticate animals. We domesticate them and control them as food sources so we can have meat. We can have their skin and fur and bones for tools and shelter. We start to build shelters out of wood and mud. And then we start to use them for milk. I don't know who that first person was who milked a goat, but on behalf of all humanity, thank you. That's pretty amazing to milk a goat. And then we start getting milk, and we start to be able to sustain ourselves and settle down and build communities. So what comes with these communities? Well, we need to write things down. This is very important. This is where history begins. History begins when our ancestors started to write things down. And what did they write down? Well, when you have a lot of people living together, you have to have some order. So they start writing down rules, laws, how we're supposed to behave, how we're supposed to interact with one another. So think of your classroom or your workplace or your home as a mini version of this, where we all have to get along and work together and make sure our community thrives. So they started writing down laws, and then they started to have leisure time. When we were hunters and gatherers, there was no leisure time. You're always looking around, someone going to kill me? Where's my next meal going to come from? When you have a civilization beginning with history, you get leisure time, and this is where we also start to create arts, okay? We start to create poetry, writing things and thoughts that come to us, and we also start looking at the sky, at the stars, and wondering, well, what happens to Uncle Joe? He died last month. What happens? Does anything happen to us? So we also start to develop religion, spirituality, and with that comes scriptures. So that starts to happen, okay? And then you start developing things like government, leaders, people who help the leader, and religious leaders to guide people spiritually, religiously. So this is where we see civilization beginning, okay? Civilization begins when we start writing things down. We have laws, we have religion, and also we start to treat each other differently than animals do. We start to heal each other. When we were hunters and gatherers, if you injured yourself or were injured in a hunt or in a battle, that was it. You were finished. People had to move on. They couldn't afford to take care of you. They had to take care of themselves, and we can understand that. But when we get a civilization, what we start doing is taking care of each other when we get sick, when we get injured. And we know this because there have been archaeological and anthropological findings that show that our ancient ancestors were healing themselves and healing each other. Okay? So I want you to keep that in mind. And remember this. I'm going to leave you with this point too. All these early civilizations started where there's rivers. Riverbanks where food grows, okay? It happens in Mesopotamia, Sumeria, what's now Iraq, I just mentioned, that fertile crescent that goes from Iraq all the way into what we would call Palestine, Lebanon, and Israel. That's where it starts, but that's not the only place this is happening. In China, in the Yangtze River Valley, people start to manipulate rice as a food source. In India, in the Indus River Valley, they start to cultivate food along the river. And in the Americas, you have in central Mexico and what's now Peru, you have great Native American civilization starting because they learned to control their food source. Agriculture, okay? Growing things. It's at the heart of history. And remember, so is geography. We'll talk more about that later, but geography also helps shape history and drive history. So I hope this is helpful. We'll get to New Mexico in the next few episodes of New Mexico History in 10 minutes. So thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Hasta pronto.